Anyway, grab your hat and hold on, because all of these are rich studies, and if we were studying them individually, we would be taking a long time to do it. But in a survey like this, we can't devote attention to each and every passage that we would like to. However, there is something extremely significant in this lesson, and that's in our memory verses, Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Well, we'll get to that in just a few moments, so we'll hold off until we get there. Some key points: God knows all things, even future things, which no man could discern. And God also allows evil people to have temporary victories, but He and His people will prevail. So there are times when things don't look like they're going exactly right, but God will prevail, and His people will prevail. Some people on earth may have a hard time, especially when you consider Christians in the first century and following who were put to death. But ultimately, they triumph and prevail. Excuse me. Oh, well, you both got one? Okay. All right. Okay, so we have 6 chapters to conclude between tonight and Wednesday night. We have the vision of the 4 beasts. We have the vision of the rise of Medo-Persia. We have the vision of the 70 weeks, the vision of the glory of God, the vision of coming conflicts, and the final vision of tribulation and resurrection. So, again, those are, I've read lengthy chapters in books, in commentaries, just on one of these chapters. So there's a lot more material that we can get in depth on, but let's get started with some of the key and most important things. In chapters 1 and 3 and 5 and 6, we saw primarily narratives showing the faithfulness of God's servants in a foreign land as captives in that land. Chapter 4 included a dream of what was shortly going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. But remember, previously in chapter 2, he had the dream of the 4 world empires that were about to arise. And so now we're up to the remainder of the book. And chapters 7 and 8 actually occur chronologically before chapter 5. Since they are in the 1st and 3rd years of the reign of Belshazzar, and chapter 5 discusses the conclusion of his reign. Sometimes in prophetic literature, things are not always chronological. These 2 chapters actually go before chapter 5. In Daniel's first dream, he saw the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the Mediterranean Sea, and 4 beasts came out of the sea. Now, this is not anything new. This is simply another representation of what Daniel explained to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. But what did he see? The first beast was like a lion, but it had eagle's wings, which were plucked off. It was lifted up from the earth and made to stand like a man on 2 feet. What would that kingdom be? Babylon, right. Okay, the second was like a ferocious bear whose body was raised on one side and had 3 ribs in his mouth. And that represents Medo-Persia. The third one was a leopard with 4 wings on its back and 4 heads also. And that represents Greece. And then the fourth one was a strong, dreadful creature with 10 horns and huge iron teeth. It trampled everything in its path. One little horn came up and replaced 3 others. It had the eyes of a man and spoke pompous words. And that would be then Rome. Okay. Now, the scene changed to one of judgment with Jehovah in heaven in white clothing and white hair as wool. He sat upon a fiery throne with flaming wheels. Millions of angels ministered unto him, and the books were opened. By the way, as we read through this, even just summarizing it, do you begin to see where a lot of the terminology in Revelation comes from? Comes from a lot of these visions that Daniel saw. The books were opened. The kingdoms were all taken away from those who had possessed them, and the fourth that spoke pompous words was destroyed. So when the books were opened, what happened? Judgment, exactly. When the books were opened, God rendered judgment. And is not the same thing true in Revelation? Okay. All right. The Son of Man, Jesus, came on clouds to the Ancient of Days. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Peter describes this in Acts 2. I just listed verse 33, but about verse 29 through 35 actually gives it. He ascended into heaven on clouds in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, verses 9 through 11. But he ascended and was given that which was promised by the Holy Spirit. In other words, he received his kingdom, which is the context of verses 29 and 30, 31 and 32. All right. So he received his kingdom. Verse 13 refutes the theory of premillennialism. Jesus did not come to earth to receive a kingdom. He went to heaven to receive a kingdom. Premillennialists have it backwards, just as they have about everything backwards. But this is not Jesus coming to earth and ruling in Jerusalem, as they claim. This is Jesus going to the Father, to the Ancient of Days in the clouds. And he's receiving his kingdom when he arrives. This is the kingdom that was promised to David by the prophet in 2 Samuel 7, 13 through 16. His descendant would reign on the throne. And he's not talking about Solomon, because this kingdom has no end. Solomon had an end, and so did his kingdom. But neither Jesus nor his kingdom ever come to an end. All right, so this is a significant passage in the book of Daniel. That's the memory verse on the preceding page. Let's go ahead and read that. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Coming where? To earth? No. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. This would be the Father. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. And his kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed. Remember, that's how Daniel explained the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't it? In the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Well, this is a vision of Christ ascending to the Father and being given that kingdom. So this is a great pair of verses to be able to remember. All right. Any questions or comments concerning those things? No? Okay. All right then. Number 3, confused, Daniel approached one of the angels who stood near the throne for an interpretation. He didn't have the whole rest of the Bible, and especially he didn't have the New Testament in the book of Acts. So whereas we have an easy time figuring out how these things were fulfilled, Daniel was kind of stunned. How is all of this going to play out, and when? And he explained that the beast represented 4 kings who arise out of the earth, but the saints shall receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Even though the little horn was now waging war against the saints and would prevail against them for a time, the Ancient of Days would make them ultimately triumphant. So this is indeed a picture of what is to come. The saints are given the kingdom when, on the day of Pentecost, those who responded to the preaching of Peter, those who gladly received his word, Acts 2:41, were baptized. And the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And verse 47, they were adding to the church daily those who were being saved. God added them to the church, those who were being saved. So the church, the spiritual kingdom, was established, and the saints of the Most High were part of it. Jesus received that kingdom. Saints were added to the kingdom, the church. And so all of this in Daniel 7 was fulfilled by the, most of it was fulfilled by the time of Acts 2. The persecution followed later. And war was made on the part of Rome against the kingdom. Remember, the kingdom was those kings, the Roman emperors. They didn't like the conflict. They didn't like anyone giving higher allegiance to Jesus than to Caesar. And so it was Rome that made war on the saints. And I believe that's what the book of Revelation is describing. I know we have a lot of brethren, or some brethren, who believe that that's talking about the Jews making war. But you don't read anything, and the Jews did resist the kingdom, there's no question about that. But he's not talking about the Jews in this prophecy, is he? He's talking about the king, the 4th kingdom that had the power to persecute the saints. And that's exactly what we find in the book of Revelation. All right, anybody have any thoughts or comments concerning that? Yes. Well, the Roman government had a constant conflict with the Jews. But after AD 70, when the temple was destroyed and a lot of the Jews were killed, their attention on persecution turned to the church, turned to the kingdom that was supplanting theirs. And it did ultimately supplant the Roman Empire, didn't it? Okay. Anybody else have a comment? Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. That's the group that Andre ran into a couple of times, and we commented on the stuff they were producing. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, they were referring to the texture, not the color. But the color is obviously white on his hair. Okay. Anybody else have a comment? It never ceases to amaze me what some religious groups claim or try to claim. Uh, anyway, anybody else? All right. Well, let's go on to chapter 8. 2 years later, Daniel saw another vision in Shushan, near the river Ulai. He saw a ram with two horns, one higher than the other. It was attacked by a male goat from the west. All right, well, we have, of course, Medo-Persia, which would be symbolized by having two horns. But he's attacked from a goat from the west. And where was Greece located from Medo-Persia? To the west. All right. It was so swift that he did not touch the ground. They had this movie on, and I couldn't resist watching it for a few minutes. Ended up watching the whole thing. Did anybody else see, what was it? Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or something like that? And all these people were running without hardly touching the ground. I thought, this is the silliest thing I've ever seen, but I couldn't quit watching it. Anyway, that's kind of the description that we have here, that he runs so swift that his feet don't even touch the ground. All right? When the goat became strong, the large horn was broken, and 4 other horns took its place. One of those horns increased in influence, its influence toward the Holy Land, towards Jerusalem. Despite shutting down the temple and casting truth down to the ground, he prospered. One angel asked how long this awful condition would persist. The answer was 2,300 days. That's not exactly a biblically significant number, symbolic. I'm not quite sure what to make out of 2,300 days. That would be what? A period of about 6 years or 6 1/3 years? If there's some significance in that, I don't know what it is. Most symbols or most numbers do have symbolic meaning, but I can't figure out what this one is. And I don't think it's literal either, because from the time the temple was desecrated until it was restored, I believe was only 3 years. However, maybe it's including something else besides that. I don't know if it's intended to be literal. But anyway, well, first of all, before we get into what that is, how far in the future is this that's being discussed? We're now talking about who is the big powerful horn? Anybody? Alexander the Great. And when he died, his kingdom was split into 4 parts, thus the 4 horns. And the one being described here is Antiochus Epiphanes, which I think we get to in just a couple minutes here. But how far in advance is all of this? Now remember, Daniel is prophesying this during the captivity between the time of 606 and 536. But when do these events take place? I think I have it on the next page. Oh, yeah, but he became prominent. Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But about what time period, though, are we talking about? We're talking about the about 160 BC. This prophecy is made prior to 536 BC. We're talking about something 300 years in advance. Now, just to give a perspective on that, War of Independence was fought when? 1776, Declaration of Independence. The war fought till 1789 when the thing was. I feel safe asking that question in here because people used to be taught history. There's some places I'd be reluctant to ask that question. You know, they've had interviews with people on television. When was the Revolutionary War fought? Was that back in the 1960s? No, it was a little longer than that. It's incredible what people no longer know that you would take for granted that everybody knew. But anyway, so imagine Thomas Jefferson writing in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 things that were going to happen in the year 2076. Would that freak you out? I knew he was smart, but I didn't know he was that smart. 300 years in advance. That's incredible that anybody could predict at such a time, such an earlier time. 300 years in advance, he's talking about these kings and who's going to have power and who's going to rule. And nobody's even heard of Greece at this point. Yes. Oh, yeah. Are their primary sources. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, since they did rely on the Bible so much, that might explain why some people don't value the Constitution either, because they don't value the Bible. But just a quick point on that, they studied almost everything that had been written about government. They did not pull our government and the Constitution out of a hat. They went to every precedent they could find and tried to put in it what works and put in safeguards, which they did. Why isn't it working? Well, I don't think they ever thought that the press would become so biased and not do their job. I think they thought that the press would remain objective, but that's not happened. You know, you hear about some things and you don't hear about some things depending on what they wish to report. But anyway, that's another topic. If I get off on that, we'll never get back. All right. But still, 300 years in advance, this is simply incredible. There is no way that any human being working on his own knowledge could foresee this happening. This has to be a divine revelation by one who knows what will happen. All right. Number 5, we'll get back to some of these specifics here in a minute. Number 5, the angel Gabriel was asked to explain the vision to Daniel, as you might well imagine. As he came near, Daniel fell to the ground out of respect. Gabriel said this vision pertained to the time of the end. The end of what? The time of the end. Well, that's something to keep in mind, isn't it? Gabriel lifted Daniel up. The ram was Medo-Persia, who would be conquered by Greece. The large horn was their first king, Alexander the Great. When that horn was broken, does anybody remember how old Alexander was when he died? All right. He conquered almost the entire world, as much of it as he could handle, by the age of 30. Is that incredible? But no wonder he said not to touch the ground. I just think how swift that was to be able to have such a great accomplishment. And it's reported that he said, "Oh, that I had more worlds to conquer." If he had had more, he probably could have done it. But anyway, he conquered every major kingdom, got clear over into India. But anyway, he died at a young age. Most scholars believe that the horn that gained prominence was Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, there were 4 rulers, but 2 of these gained prominence. The one in the north, who was Antiochus, and one in the south, probably the Ptolemies. And eventually, Antiochus gained supremacy over that. So this takes place over quite a few years of time. The vision was to be sealed up because it was many days in the future until its fulfillment. Daniel was faint and sick, so later he went back to work pondering what he had seen. Another thought about that, these things were sealed up because they were so far in the future. Book of Revelation was not sealed up because its time was at hand. I don't know how premillennialists can justify Daniel's stuff being sealed up because it was so far away when it happened within a few hundred years, but they think we haven't got to anything in the book of Revelation yet, and it's been 2,000 years. That doesn't quite work out, does it? Things in Revelation began to be fulfilled immediately. It's not something that's going to happen another 100 years from now. It's already happened. It deals with the Roman Empire. But premillennialists have a whole different view of those types of things. But anyway, this would be one thing they would try to have to deal with, is how come this was sealed up when it was only a few hundred years and we're far past that. All right. Any other questions or comments there? Yes. Well, he's pretty late because the kingdom fell with Belshazzar. I don't remember exactly how long Belshazzar reigned, but these two were in the beginning of his reign. So chapter 5 deals with the end of his reign, and when his reign ended, of course, Medo-Persia conquered Babylon. So we're probably, if he reigned 20 years, we're probably 20 years out then, you know. If he only reigned 10 years, we're only 10 years out until Medo-Persia. Oh yeah, he's probably at least 60, I would imagine. Probably in his teens, and he's 70 years later, he's going to be about 85. So he's probably in his 70s, 60s or 70s at this time at least. I think it would shake you up at any age, but yeah, okay. Yes. Oh, yeah, good point. For somebody who wants to say, and there are modernist scholars who say, well, this book wasn't really written before 536. It was written later or somebody amended it. But that doesn't work because the Septuagint was translated probably prior to 250 BC, and Antioch Epiphanes, it doesn't come to power for another 90 years. So that just doesn't work. The modernistic approach to the scriptures just simply fails. Yeah. Yeah. And there's either 2 or 3 authors of Isaiah, and David didn't write the Psalms. And I mean, they just go through and have a bunch of wild speculation that's not based on anything solid at all, which is why we pretty much ignore what they say. Yes, Frank. Well, God knows what's going to happen, and that doesn't necessarily mean that he brings it about. He just knows that it's going to happen. Now, he can bring some things about, but he doesn't generally do that unless it relates to Christ and his sacrifice and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, and they did in the first century with Christians. And you know, you do have sometimes those temporary defeats, but those martyrs who were under the altar are later seen above it, and they're no longer under the altar. They are reigning with Christ. So yes, they took the lives of many Christians in some of the persecutions, but those who remain faithful always come out on top. And the persecutors, they're the ones who really need to worry about their future, according to 2 Thessalonians 1, 7 through 9. Okay, anybody else have a comment? All right. Number 6, Daniel knew from Jeremiah's prophecy that Jerusalem would be desolate for 70 years, which meant that he knew the time frame was almost up by the first year of Darius. Darius came to power just a couple of years before the decree was issued, and Cyrus. Daniel prayed earnestly that God might end their captivity and allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem. He fasted in sackcloth and ashes and confessed the sins of the nation. He admitted that their sins were shameful and that God had punished them exactly as he had warned that he would. He asked God to restore them, not because they merited his favor, but because God was merciful and the heathen nations were mocking God at the sight of his holy city in ruins. They should be allowed to return for God's sake as well as theirs. Oh, that's a pretty good prayer, isn't it? Well thought out and well reasoned. Okay, any questions or comments on that? All right, let's go to number 7. As he began to pray, Gabriel was sent to him because he was... Well, wait a minute. Before we do that, let's go down to number 10. And just to give you this time frame, and probably need to remind ourselves of it later, but we've been talking about this. Alexander the Great, who was the big horn representing Greece, died in 323 BC. Now remember, these prophecies were made in before 536. And the Ptolemies, who were actually Greek, ruled in Egypt until about 30 BC. You remember Ptolemy and his famous sister? Cleopatra. Okay. Who also had a lot of contact with Julius Caesar and with Mark Antony, as you may recall also. But anyway, the Ptolemies ruled in Egypt. In the region of Syria, the Seleucids, who were also Greeks, began their rule a little bit later and ended it a little bit earlier. So they're fairly well parallel, but not precisely parallel. Eventually, in the north, Antiochus Epiphanes reigned from 175 to 163 BC. And he's the one who persecuted the Jews and brought about the Maccabean revolt, as Guy mentioned earlier. That is a couple of the books of the Apocrypha that were written that described what happened with the revolt and the success of the Jews fighting against him. But anyway, he exalted and magnified himself above every god, including Jehovah. As with all evil kings, however, his demise would come about. So these are the things that Daniel has been seeing. And according to tradition, and I don't know how well established this is, but Antiochus Epiphanes offered up a sow in the temple of Jerusalem, which, of course, you know, that was totally sacrilegious for Jews. He offered up a sow to Jupiter on December 25th, 167 BC. There was the revolt, and as part of that, the Jews regained the temple and utterly cleansed it. They had to purge it. They had to purify the temple. And this took place on December 25th, 164 BC. And as you can see, Antiochus Epiphanes didn't reign but another year after that. This was an important time period in Jewish history, but it's not mentioned in the Old or New Testament. It was a key event in their thinking, but God didn't choose to mention it or give us anything really about what happened. So some of this time between the Testaments has some very significant things occurring that give rise to maybe understanding a few things in the New Testament, but you don't really need it. The New Testament stands on its own merit if you don't know any of the history between the Testaments. All right. Any final comments that anybody wants to make concerning these matters? Okay, start at number 7 then, Lord